Wish politicians look out for miners, and not just miners on an island somewhere. Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to heat, and the whole beast milking welfare. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground, 'cause all this damn country does is keep on kicking them down.
That guy went from just a farmer who got invited onto a radio show, a radio program. That's why the YouTube video is the W whatever. Filmed that, got put on YouTube, jumped to TikTok. It went uber viral, millions of views in 24 hours. Just enormous. And it's one, obviously, it's intensely real, right? So it's just picked up on that. And two, it tells a story about what it's like to be in America right now and how people feel about being lost in their own country. That is so, it's so perfect and sad and perfect.
It is. It's funny for a show where we do a lot of reactions to things like that. The only reaction I can really muster is like kind of just silence. 'Cause it's impactful and it's true. And I think he's speaking to a very overtly silent group of people who maybe feel forgotten, which, you know, was a lot of the rationale behind why Trump was elected in 2016, right? People felt ignored by the political establishment. And I mean, I think there's probably some reason why this song is going mega viral right now, because it's speaking to people who feel like they've been forgotten or they're not being heard.
I think there's also something where it seems like entertainment over the last decade or two has become like super heavily corporate and safe in a way. And we're starting to see all these like new up and comers coming out that are a little bit more counterculture, or at least we're watching the cultures shifting in a great way, where there's like new messaging that's entering the art sphere now. You know, there's people like, you know, there's a bunch of like up and coming rappers like Tom McDonald, who's very countercultural. You're seeing there's so much backlash happening to old school guys like Ice Cube lately. And now he's kind of being embraced by like new culture, usually, especially after everything that happened with COVID, where he like lost the $20 million deal and all that stuff. So yeah, it's just interesting to see how the culture is moving right now.
For a long, long time, the right basically said, the left owns all the culture. What are we supposed to do? How can we win? How can we make movies and film and all that kind of stuff? And we have the biggest box office grosser for the year is The Sound of Freedom. And this guy blowing up, I mean, going from just a farmer singing in the field with his dogs to now he has major country music artists saying, I'll produce your show, I'll fund the production of your first album, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like, the guy has a real opportunity. I don't know. So it's this interesting paradox, right? Because it points to the fundamental unfairness of a world where merit isn't respected anymore, where people don't get their just desserts while people are rewarded not based upon what they contribute. And it claims this, it holds this ground and says this is unjust, while simultaneously it being a huge success story of this guy's passion for music, for singing, for saying something true, completely making him an overnight star. It's this interesting paradox that we live in all the time, and you know that's what's so fascinating to watch.
Absolutely, and it shows the power of art to be able to change the narrative. It is the narrative, right? I mean, the things we talk about, the things that we care about, ultimately, politics, yes, you know, culture is more relatable to most people. People can sometimes ignore politics or put it on the back burner because they don't want to get embroiled in the, you know, the heated polarized debate or whatever. But like culture is everything, and music particularly is something that 99% of people can resonate with, and that's a beautiful piece.
Well, it's like the old Andrew Breitbart quote, that politics is downstream from culture. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of people that kind of enter the political sphere and they just think politics is everything. But largely speaking, politics isn't going to change unless kind of the underlying culture of a society changes. And kind of what I was saying with how kind of corporate all of our entertainment has become. Like we're watching all the stuff that's happening with Hollywood right now with like the writer's strike and kind of like everybody's kind of getting sick of the old movies. And it seems like our culture is kind of being exported elsewhere, especially with the younger generation. And like it's interesting to just watch these new up and comers come out of the woodworks now, and everybody's just starting to embrace them. It's like there's like a certain authenticity there that's with these newcomers, and everybody's just like, oh my God, there's something different. Like it's not like the same old garbage that we keep hearing over and over and over again, right?
Yeah. It's the same countercultural thing that we've talked about in episodes past, where if AI copywriting becomes a thing, there will be a demand for real, authentic, human created content, right? And similarly, where we have this very plastic, manufactured, mono narrative media, there is obviously, judging by this guy's success, a lot of demand for the real, authentic, heartfelt storytelling of people that feel like they've been forgotten. So super powerful stuff. Thanks for starting with that.
Yeah.
It's refreshing. It's a positive note. I mean, it's obviously a somber tune, but I think it's a really great thing to see a guy go from nothing to stardom for something that really means something.
Yeah, I hope he can turn it into something. Like I hope it's not just like a one-hit wonder type of a thing, and he can actually just build something great out of this. I'll be following. I'll subscribe to him. And
absolutely,
see what he's doing.
Absolutely, we'll put his link in the show notes in case you haven't checked him out yet.
Yeah, Oliver Anthony was the guy's name.
Well, thanks for tuning in, and welcome back to the Liberty Portal podcast, or what will be the last episode of the Liberty Portal podcast as you know it. We'll talk about that more in a second. Today, the news we're going to be covering is pretty varied. There is new evidence of voter fraud out of Michigan stemming from the 2016 election, the 2020 election. We've got important developments in the Middle East and Taiwan, so some foreign policy stuff to cover. And we've got a glorified traffic cone, as he is self-described, sentenced to 4 years in prison for his involvement in the George Floyd murder or death. Is it a death, murder?
Depends on your perspective.
I guess it depends on your perspective. We're going to get into it.
Murder's subjective.
Right. And lastly, bank records that were just released show that the Biden family has received millions in payments from foreign governments without registering as a foreign agent. So we've now got proof that the Biden family is working with foreign agents, foreign governments, foreign entities without going through the proper steps to establish that they should be and can be doing that, just adding fuel to the fire of the influence peddling scandal that is just kind of burning out of control right now in DC. Before we get into that stuff, we've got the usual suspects, and we should talk about our plans for the new episode. David Rand, how are you?
Doing great. Yeah, excited for the growth of this thing. We've gotten semi-viral in the last week with some of our reactions, so we're obviously touching on the right kind of new strategy to grow this thing and allow us to impact more people and help people think more carefully about the news.
Absolutely. And we thank you for watching, for sharing, for liking, commenting, and all that stuff that you're doing for us. It is making a difference. It means everything to this man. Kyle, how are you?
It's good. Captain Quigley on Twitter, if you want to see me LARP as a penguin. Otherwise, for new listeners, you probably have no idea what I'm saying right there. But no, I'm looking forward to doing this and kind of our strategy going forward on everything. I'm looking forward to kind of talking about that.
Yeah. So before we get into the news, just really quick, we are going to be rebranding the show. We love the Liberty Portal podcast. It does have a certain connotation. It does speak to a certain audience, and our mission here is broader than just speaking to folks who might already be close to the liberty movement, right? Or already involved in politics. We want to speak more to culture, right, overall, and maybe less directly to politics specifically, and try to bring more people into the fold and bring more people who might not necessarily consider themselves political in nature into a way of thinking about the world that allows them the tools to separate from the mono narrative, to protect ourselves, each other, from deception and manipulation by media narratives. And so we're going to rebrand the show something that's a little bit more appealing potentially to more people, right? And David, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we very first started, we had this great meeting with a guy that I actually did jiu-jitsu with named Will, who gave us a lot of great advice. And Will's like, look, guys, I'm not a political person at all, but I think your podcast is really good for X, Y, and Z reasons, and you got something good going on here. Here's some advice about how you can help make your thing grow. We took advice, and it's really helped. And from that moment, I was always like picturing him in my head when we were like, okay, who's our audience? Well, I don't want to just talk to just people who already think like me. I want to talk to people who aren't specialists in this area, who don't know how to think about the news from a systematic, integrated, point of view, from a principle-based point of view, and help teach them how to do that so they can do that for themselves. Like, that is empowerment versus like just, giving people fish. I want to teach people how to fish as much as we can. So and one of the things I was, I love what the guys are doing at Liberty Portal, selling books and doing their stuff. And we want to keep, working with them and supporting them. But we think that with a brand like this, we can approach more people with this message and help more people who are kind of in that same spot as well, without having that immediate barrier, because Will didn't have that barrier because he knows me, right? We helped, strangle each other, and nothing forges a bond faster than that. So, so therefore he didn't have that barrier. But a lot of people, if they first came across one of our clips, they'd be like, Liberty Portal, I don't know. We kind of had that feeling that it was a bit of a barrier. So we want to try to see how we can use this brand to reach more people.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to debut it for you next week on our next episode. We're going to roll out the new branding. You'll see the names change across all the social media. Nothing else is going to change. You won't need to follow any new pages. It's all going to be the same stuff, but just a new name, a new look, and the same content, the great content that we have been honored to be able to produce for you, and that you've become accustomed to hearing and seeing from us. And of course, going forward, again, if you have any ideas, questions, suggestions, please do drop us a comment. Drop us a direct message on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere that you happen to be listening to this. We appreciate hearing from you. It really helps us make the show better and serve you better. So without further ado, let's drop right into the first story here. We've got new evidence out of Michigan claiming voter fraud that occurred in the 2020 election. David, why don't you set the stage for us here?
All right. So there's this business, right, called GBI Strategies. It's an operation out of Tennessee since 2014. It's a Democrat vendor group, and this is very common, right? So what happens is you have these campaigns, they hire on folks to do certain parts of the campaign. Sometimes it's communications, development, donors, and stuff like that. Other times it's actual field. These folks were get out the vote specialists who worked on grassroots campaigns to get out the vote. They hired canvassers, $15 an hour, expenses paid, prepaid card, and rental cars, right?
And so those folks go door to door and do things
register
for
people to vote and do what's called ballot harvesting, which is where after votes have gone out on early vote and mail-in voting, they go and they say, hey, I'll help you. I'll get your ballot turned in by hand right now.
Okay.
If you just give it to me.
And that's perfectly legal, right? I mean, because there's
in some states.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right? Because there's maybe elderly folks who have trouble dealing with that or whatever, right? Like maybe there's some legitimate reasons why it could be a positive thing.
And people have the First Amendment right to ask somebody, hey, are you registered to vote? And they have, of course, the freedom to say, hey, let me help you register to vote, right? If they struggle with that.
Yeah.
So the question is how much of this is real, is authentic, and that's what's really interesting here. We have one gal named Brianna Hawkins, who submitted 8,000 to 10,000 ballots at one time, and the amount of evidence that what Brianna specifically was doing is pretty substantial that it was fraud. So the source claims in October, the FBI were handed Michigan voter fraud case files, right? This is another part of this is that the federal government's been very unreliable in following up on this. So back in October, the FBI released their, got basically handed by the police in Michigan an accusation of voter fraud, and they didn't do anything with it. This is early on from the primary election that year.
So this is October of 2020.
Yes, and then afterwards we have the November case, which is where Brianna Hawkins comes in because absentee ballots go out in that October timeframe. In this one, they handed over to FBI, but the police kept following up on it. Is what it seems to be saying. A lot of this is from Gateway Pundit, so it's a blog, but they've broken some pretty major stories, although they're not perfect like everybody else. So the FBI gets over that, but the FBI keeps cold handling these, meaning they get them and then they never seem to follow up on them. Increasing, the police found so the police following up on this was looking at GBI, got a warrant for their headquarters in Michigan, went there and found Pelican cases of semi and fully automatic rifles. with joint suppressors, optics, and customized pistols.
At a
And
election?
silencers at this
HQ?
vendor's headquarters.
GBI's headquarters.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes, in Michigan, on a search warrant. Now, all of them were determined to be legal by the ATF.
It doesn't.
Fully automatic weapons in, wait a minute, Michigan.
Oh.
You know, right? Michigan isn't the most Second Amendment friendly state, right?
No.
I mean, like they have a rural population that is gun friendly, but it's that's strange. So,
Well, and yeah, why would a company that is supporting elections and campaigns have Pelican cases full of weapons? I mean, semi or fully auto doesn't super matter. Like, why would they have just cases full of guns?
No one knows. Just red flags. I mean, it's when I was writing that down, I was like, is this relevant? I was like, wait, of course it's relevant. Why? You know, so it's like, it's a great question. We need to know. And the only way you know is if you ask the question, and then, you know, someone can make a lot of money in the press actually doing the investigative journalism. So police also found partially filled out voter registration cards, which is very interesting as well because of the implications here. Now, let's rewind back. This is 2020. It's forever ago. And it feels like we're adjudicating something really old, but it is relevant now because it was Trump's claims that there was fraud in the election, which led to this last implied thing, right? It's his speech about those elections that seems to say that he encouraged the people to overthrow the government on January 6th, right? That's the accusation, the last indictment. So what matters is if he was knowingly saying a false thing, or if that thing was, he said, was, even if it was a lie, but actually turned out to be true, that would be a major development, right? So when it comes to Michigan, he won Michigan by 15,000 votes last time in 2016. He lost by 150,000 votes in 2020.
Wow.
Right. So like you can look at that. And a lot of people say that's just skepticism, but I'm not sure it's necessarily fraud, right? That doesn't tell you anything. All it says is that he just lost by a lot when he won by a lot. That could tell you more about how much Hillary Clinton's hated than how people, you know, feel about Joe Biden.
Sure.
Also, additionally, that keep in mind, we had the summer of George Floyd, we had COVID, all that kind of stuff all happened at that time. So there was a lot of, you know, unrest, and people tend to, whenever there's unrest, just vote against the incumbent.
Sure.
But what we do have is with this case, if the fraud case here were common across GBI, who had approximately 40 canvassers employees, then it could be enough to impact 150,000. Think about it. 40 times 80 or times 8,000 in a single day across 30 days. You can get way past 140, 50.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the question is how many of these ballots are authentic and how many are dropped off?
So my question
are real. And the evidence that Breonna Hawkins, which her specific ballots in this like sample of her ballots have been found to be substantially like fraudulent in nature, right?
And what criteria are they using to establish that those are fraudulent?
Not matching the voter file signature, not having valid addresses, not having a whole bunch of things that are necessary to validate someone's voter registration with their ballot submission via mail ballot. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So, in the folks that are kind of trying to bring up this evidence, it's important to know, and I think this actually is errors made a lot. And when they talked about the story a lot this week, they were like, "This is smoking gun evidence." It isn't. It's evidence. It's not smoking gun evidence that's systemic fraud, but there's a possibility here, right? There's like smoking gun means we have the entire paper trail and we don't, right? We don't know. If we had GBI's internal documents saying everyone commit fraud, that's one thing. But if Breonna Hawkins just happened to be a rogue employee, we can't just assume that. And I see a lot of right wingers just doing that. They're saying, oh, they're a lefty, so therefore they're all committing fraud. That's just dumb. Okay, so it's important to note that in order to bring a lawsuit challenging an election, it must be proven that the challenge itself, like the accusation, if true, could have changed the election. Does that make sense? And this is a very strange part of our jurisprudence around election fraud.
So in order to bring a lawsuit challenging the election, it has to be established that the thing being challenged could have changed the outcome.
Right.
So if Biden had won by like so many votes that it's like just impossible for any challenge in a given state to overturn that, they would throw it out.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Before it can even be heard. Right. That's the important part, right? So the accusation has to be on scale enough for a judge to say, okay, this could have overthrown the election.
Is this accusation on that scale?
Well, that was my case, right? It seems to be if they can prove that GBI, all 40 canvassers were doing the same thing as Brianna Hawkins, and yeah. The question is, and it isn't clear to me if that's the case they're going to make, right? Because if you just say, well, Brianna Hawkins, therefore the election's overthrown, it's like that won't work. You have to say that there was this firm that had this practice, and this firm had this big of impact that was bigger than 150,000. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the firm has an ideological bent. It's a Democratic firm. So, and additionally to this, what's really interesting is this corroborates testimony that was given about this from a poll watcher in Michigan.
Writing down the ballot numbers and the last names of the person of the ballot that had the name on that ballot, they were all in sequence. These are absentee ballots, mail-in ballots. They cannot be in sequence. 2232 cannot have 2233 next to it, because if they're mailed in, they come in all different numbers. And when I started noticing that these numbers are almost next to each other, like one or the other was in the middle, but then they were almost next to each other, my antennas went up. That's exactly when I thought something is not right here. Then I asked the supervisor. There was not even a date on those envelopes. It said November 0-2020. There was no second number there. Then I said, what is the date on this one? Then they got really mad at me. They said, you're not letting us do our job. You're disturbing us. And at that point, because we really don't want to be kicked out, so we were just kind of not challenging anything because we want to still stay in the room because we barely had anybody. Not only that, the sequence ballot numbers were all from the same area, like the Goddard Street in the downtown Detroit. Goddard Street, sequential ballots, signatures were all alike. They had no date stamp. It said, like, it was empty after 0. There was no third or second or first or nothing. And none of them were coming up in the system. They were all being entered manually. They even knew that none of these details would even be in the poll book or in the system.
Wow.
So let's talk about what a poll watcher is, because a lot of people don't know this. So basically how elections should work is you have the election workers, and then each party and even outside groups can have people who observe what's going on in order to make sure that there's no fraud, right? So what she was a Republican poll watcher, watching the people who are employed by the government go through the ballots. And what she noticed was that the ballots that they were going through were in sequential order. So each ballot has a number that has a sequential order to it. If that's true, that's very interesting, right? Because if you were, for example, filling out ballots in mass, you might fill them out in order to make sure that you were
you just got a stack of ballots that were just freshly printed, right? And
right.
You just go serial number by serial number.
Right. The question is like if they're doing their job, what they should be doing is checking that against a voter file, right? So if someone ordered them. Right. It doesn't. At what stage would it be ordered? Would be interesting, right? Unless it was handled by an intermediary, like a ballot harvester, right? So even if they go out and they get it, for some reason they would then order they would take all these ballots in, right, out of order them, and then hand them to the government. That would be very what's the gain in putting them in order?
It would take so much time.
Right.
It's not worth the energy. I don't understand why you would do that.
Right. Especially when you have a limited means time to go out and get out the vote. Like, you're in a lot of pressure. So why would you? So I'm not saying that I'm not trying to engage in conspiracy theorizing, but I do think that we have this strange magic word problem.
Election integrity.
With elections, where we say it has to be, there can't be fraud. Because if there were fraud, I'd have to question premises. I don't want to ever have to question.
Yeah.
And I can't go with that. My allegiance is too much to the truth.
Yeah.
To go with that. It's just head in the sand type approach, especially because we know fraud has existed.
If you are a small business owner looking for exponential growth, you have to connect with Adam Thuen at Intellectual Patriots. He will revolutionize your business game and help you get to the next level. Adam can streamline your business practices and advertising strategies to improve your bottom line. His expertise in data engineering means he can build you the systems you need to collect and analyze market data. His mission is to provide you with invaluable insights to fuel your success. From grant writing and business proposals to digital systems integrations, even AI management, Intellectual Patriots is a one-stop shop for cutting-edge solutions. Don't wait another second. Visit intelpatriots.com to learn more. That's INTEL Patriots.com.
We have a great story in Montana about fraud. Do you know that story?
I don't.
Okay, do you know why Montana? So Montana, Helena is the state capital of Montana, right? Do you know who the contender for state capital was back in the day when we were going from a territory to a state?
Butte.
So there was an election where they tried to like basically put the question to the public. And this is something I was told growing up in Helena, and something that I was told at the Capitol is that there was, after this election, Helena won. But years later, decades later, they find this like secret compartment somewhere in the old state capitol building where they find all these ballots that are all Butte ballots.
Whoa.
Right.
So
and
they
probably
stashed them away.
enough to overcome for Butte being the state capital.
Boy, that would have changed the trajectory for Butte.
In Helena.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and like, we know these things happen. We know, there was a shootout out down south back after World War II.
There's a famous moment called like Bloody Tuesday, and it was about a governor's race, I believe. And that had direct connections with the presidential candidate at the time. Like, I can't remember who it was. It's been a long time since I looked at that. But
yeah,
like, it's not crazy that this stuff has happened. Like mafia's stuffing ballots and things in the past is a part of our history.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I'd like to throw in too that like people might be wondering, like, why does it matter? Like, this election is so far in the past. Like, why are we re-adjudicating something that happened, 3 years ago now, almost 3 years ago? And I think it goes so far beyond, what people might just want to paint with a broad brush as like, Trump apologism or just wanting to like, see Biden like, owned in this way. This is really like, this is a nonpartisan issue because this gets to the core of, is your will as a voter being accurately represented, no matter what party you're a part of? If fraud is able to be committed within our election system, it could be your candidate next time that gets hosed. And it doesn't matter. It's really about, is the will of the people being done? And in this case, there is suspicion that it's not. And we should all care about that regardless of whose party is implicated.
Right. So imagine if you had like a gas station and you had 6 people registered to vote out of that gas station. It's not a valid address, right? You can't register people to vote there.
Right.
If someone does that and there's no check and there's no pressure to say, hey, our election is legit, then you're giving the power of that person who registered 6 people to vote at a gas station the power of 7 people to vote. And that's not fair.
It's not fair.
That's not how democracy should work. And there's an injustice to there that's fundamental. So one, I think it should be challenged on a philosophical basis. The fact that you can't say, hey, whoever's doing that, that's a criminal offense and we should go after them, right? That we should absolutely say that.
Yeah.
And then second, if voter fraud is happening, if we put our heads in the sand, all we're doing is giving power to people who are the least trustworthy, people who are particularly lying to potentially do that. So what are our policies and how do we guarantee a safe, secure, and timely election?
Right.
Those are good questions, and a whole lot of policy debate should happen there. But for the starters, we should require an ID to vote. I mean, we require ID to do so many things. We should require an ID to vote. And I can't see how anyone could be so racist as to imply that someone, because of their color of skin, couldn't figure out how to get an ID. That just ticks me off.
It's shocking in its blatant racism, right?
This thing, they don't know how to find the place to get your ID. I mean, like, come on.
Well, what do you not have the time or the resource? Like, of course, like that's a thing that anybody can do. No question.
Right.
And I mean, you have to do it to get on a plane. Mm-hmm. You have to do it for so many other things, to buy alcohol. You have to show it. Like, come on. Like, this is such a low bar. It's such a low bar. And this is one of the most important processes in our country. It's a low bar. Of course we should do that.
Well, and that could be one of those noble lies, right? Is you put out this thing as like, well, poor people can't get IDs, or, this racial group or whatever can't get IDs, but that could just be the cover for allowing more fraudulent events to happen, right?
Well, I think there's definitely a potential of that. And Patrick Bet-David was talking about it when he appeared on Rogan's podcast earlier in the week.
Last week, yeah.
Yeah. Saying that very thing, one side, I guess predominantly the left would probably say, oh yeah, we shouldn't require an ID at TSA because then that gives them the cover to say, and also we shouldn't require an ID to vote, simply because, in this, at least in the case of the last election, that may have been one of the mechanisms that allowed them to play some funny games. Who knows, right? At this point, we have some suspicion that might have been the case, so should be investigated.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where there's like enough of these variables everywhere that it should just send people's, their brain should kind of just be like, something seems off and it requires more investigation. Like, I'm not saying like, yes, 100% Trump won the election or he didn't or whatever. Like, there's just like enough of these variables everywhere, like Michigan, Maricopa County, all these different areas. There's like the D'Souza documentary, The 4,000 Mules. I watched that. I thought there was some compelling evidence in there. It's just a matter of, does it all kind of culminate into this big problem? I think it's worthy more investigating. And I think there is a magic word problem there of there's so many people in the kind of this political sphere. You have all these like poli-sci nerds that I think they require for their worldview for everything to be kosher. Like everything is completely fine. And there's like a mental block. If you say anything and be like, yeah, that's a weird variable right there. Like there's some suspicious activity that happened there. I'd like to know more about that. There's like, nope, I don't want to hear it. Like there's like this mental blocker that happens. Yeah. And I find that with political people just in general. But then it also goes on the other side. Like there's people that they really need the election for their worldview to work. They really need it to be fraudulent. Yeah. So like you have like this battling kind of religious faith that exists on both sides. And the question is, it's probably somewhere in the middle on this. But
and we can't assume that fraud would only occur on one side of the political spectrum, right? I mean, I think a Trump supporter might be inclined to say, if they felt wronged in 2020, get back at the other side and do something that's maybe a little bit more shady or fight fire with fire. The thing is, we should take the fire out of the situation, right? No one should be playing with fire. Right. This is so important. We should just keep it above board as much as possible and do whatever it takes to keep it that way.
Also, another note too is committing fraudulent elections is our foreign policy. This is what we do in other countries. Right? Like,
that always ticked me off after 2016 when they said that Trump was a president because of fraud by Russia. And I was like, you guys have been doing this foreign policy for every other country on the planet forever. And now you're mad, is assuming that Russia did this. And it didn't even turn out to be true. It was completely false and made up by the Hillary campaign.
The dossier.
So like, even then, think about the chain of reactions. Hillary loses the election, blames it on Russia. Bunch of workers on the ground all over the country in 2020 say, well, Trump cheated, therefore we should cheat. And then go do the same thing. Possibly that's it. Possibly there's no centralizing force. It could just be the other underlying incentive based upon the recklessness of the Hillary Clinton campaign making up a lie that we now know is a lie, right? After 6 years of adjudicating it, we now know it's a lie.
It could even be less decentralized than that. It even trickling down from the Hillary campaign. It could just be that a bunch of people felt so adamantly opposed to Trump that they wouldn't stop at anything to keep him from getting reelected. I mean, it could be just that people kind of lost their minds in a certain way. And it happens on both sides. And I'm really curious to see what 2024 does, because you hear a bit of the rhetoric circling that Republicans are starting to talk about like doing ballot harvesting themselves. And so it's like, well, there are going to be Hawkeyes on that from the left. And they're probably going to be calling out potentially some of the same things that we're identifying here as being problems on the left. So, I mean, it stands to be potentially a devastating shit show next year. And I'm actually really excited to see what happens.
There's also this other element of what happened in 2020 was there were all these grant programs coming from these big entities like Facebook, the Knight Foundation, the Rothschilds. Everybody gets spooked out when you hear the Rothschilds.
Can't say that word.
But the Rothschild Foundation was one of these entities. Like you can look at the money. Where they were going into specific counties. And they were basically like, in order to guard the election because of the COVID stuff that was happening, it was like, we need these election rule changes. But then you would have like these mayors of cities that'd be like, well, that needs an act from the legislature. And there's like, we will give you more money for the grant program. And then they would just like bypass the legislator. So it's one of those things where there's like this like questionable legality on voter changes that happen, on like the process changes that happened in very important counties in all of the swing states, right? And it becomes one of those things where you're like, okay, like, is it like stealing the election? Was it legal? I don't know. Like it's a question, but it was definitely shady, right? And when we're talking about this, is like Zuckerberg gave like $400 million to this, right? To these grant programs, the Knight Foundation, something like that as well. And it's just, everybody just kind of like, whatever. Like,
And very interestingly, in the one state that went the other direction, which is Florida, where DeSantis and the legislature there were careful to put in protections against some of these sort of shady things, DeSantis widened his margin from what he won the election cycle previous. He won by like 20 points or something.
Yeah, but across the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Trump won, and a lot of localities took that money too.
Sure,
Right.
Sure.
So I only know those states because I happen to be involved in those states. But I'm not sure. So just think about it epistemologically. You know that you have a shady figures giving money to a political figure trying to advocate for something. I don't have enough resolution about what exactly they were asking them to do, other than facilitate mail-in ballots in their system. And because of COVID, there was a lot more load on mail-in ballots because people didn't want to go to polls. And in some places, they actually said you couldn't go to polls, and they shut down the polls, and they made everything mail-in, which I think was wrong. I'm just saying, until you have the evidence on the other side that there was some other statistical anomaly because of what happened on the front end, it is shady, but I wouldn't rank it as like the sort of shadiness like we're seeing here with the Michigan case, or even the ones where there's videos of everything getting shut down and people taking out boxes and counting it, and that actually turned out to be a legal process, but everyone was like, how could that be a legal process?
Yeah.
It amazes me how many things are legal processes in here. And that's where the discussion really ought to be, is like, how do you make sure that your elections are very secure through the policies first? And then once your policies are secure, then you can have the discussion about where fraud happens. Yeah. But right now, I mean, in Atlanta, for example, in that example, it blew me away. I couldn't believe it, right? Because they literally sent the media home, everyone was gone, and then all of a sudden they start bringing out more ballots after everyone left and started counting. And there was all this online outrage. I was online outraged. I was like, I can't believe this. I mean, that would be completely illegal in Montana, because I know Montana's election law pretty well. And they were like, no, it's totally legal here. I had to dig to find that answer.
Wild.
So, I mean, I was like, yeah.
Well, and that was another thing, is like, I watched the D'Souza documentary back in like 2021, 2022, whenever that came out. And like what they did there, and take it for a grain of salt too, is like D'Souza's a big Trump guy. Like obviously he kind of has his views here, and he's kind of like, he's trying to prove what he believes to be true. So there may or may not be useful in that regard. But what they did was like the 4,000 Mules is they found like on security footage of like people like messing with the ballot drop-off places at like late at like 2 a.m. and things like that. And then they bought a bunch of cell phone data and tracked these people down to the entities that they were going to. And they would find them going to places like this GBI Strategies. I don't know if this was one of those, but they would like, and like you would see people putting in a bunch of ballots into the place, right? And it's like one of those things where, like,
it could be regular ballot
harvesting.
Could be regular ballot harvesting.
Could be, we don't know. Like, there's just enough of like, well, it's kind of shady that this was happening at 2 a.m, right?
Yeah. Like, 2 a.m. is a strange time.
It's like,
and if it were legit, wouldn't you do it at a normal time, like daylight hours, maybe?
But like they went through a whole process of like filtering out and tracking cell phone data and stuff. Like they went to data brokerage and did all that stuff. So
I think I think it was an interesting documentary. I watched a lot of it. I had to miss some of it for a work thing, but I did think that a lot of it could be explained by completely legal phenomena, though.
Yeah, like I needed more evidence,
and that's the question that the right has to ask, which is, it's not enough just be outraged that ballot harvesting happens when it's legal, right? Yeah. You have to say, this is legal and it should be illegal because I'm concerned about XYZ things. And then second, like and then once you've secured that, then you have that other question, okay, how do we make sure that our elections are secured? Where can we detect fraud?
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, there's some interesting evidence and data points right here. I need further investigation on those data points. And I haven't seen like the further investigation.
Yeah, probably might not be there.
Well, and that's one of the questions, right? Then
people lose their interest in this topic after a while because it's been adjudicated for so long.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Zesty Beverages. They're on a mission to the standard American diet by crafting drinks with fewer calories and more nutrients from real food. Their lineup of delicious offerings now includes Electric Peak Yerba Mate, postbiotic sodas, keto-friendly, ready-to-drink margaritas, and hard teas. Wondering what a postbiotic soda is? Well, head on over to zestybev.com to learn more and find a retailer near you. Once again, check them out online at zestybev.com. That's ZESTYBEV.com.
Much like foreign policy. Now, I want to talk about foreign policy real quick. We're going to talk about two different theaters of foreign policy because their developments happened this week. But I want to note this just think about it real quick. Foreign policy is a lot like going broke. It happens very very slowly, and then very suddenly, right? I forget whose quote that is. It's like
it's been attributed to a few different people.
Okay, yeah, but everyone just ignores it until all of a sudden, wait, we're giving money to Ukraine? It just ignores it, like, oh wait, why did they attack us? They just ignore it. It's like, oh man, soldiers are being assaulted in this barracks in the Middle East. And one of the tricks that I wanted to try to figure out with this podcast is how do we kind of equip people so that when foreign policy things happen that do affect us directly, we have that lens to be able to engage clearly in it because we've done the work ahead of time. And if more people do that, I think we'll have a more restrained and better foreign policy overall. The more people who can really tune into this stuff and understand it ahead of time before it becomes a problem, the better we'll be positioned to fight back against the establishment, interests, the blob that is always saying, well, this happened, therefore we need more interaction. Mm-hmm. Well, we're 3/4 through this escalatory spiral before anyone finds out about it. Right. And I think I actually might have detected an undercovered escalatory spiral this week. So we have a great video to start out with just to talk a little bit about the Middle East foreign policy developments for the day.
Joining me now to talk about all this, Lieutenant General Richard Newton, former U.S. Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff and NewsNation Senior National Security Contributor. Nice to see you on this Friday. Let's start with the Strait of Hormuz. I mentioned this briefly, but it's a vital seaway for global trade. Can you talk about the global impacts if ships are not allowed to pass through this area?
Well, good morning, Marnie. It is a really what I would call a strategic choke point. That's a military term for it's an absolute key area, really in the globe, around the globe. As you mentioned, 25% of the oil that passes through that choke point, but also 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas flows through there as well. So it's significant. And over the last couple of years, Iran has seized 5 commercial vessels, tankers, if you will. They've also harassed dozens, and even last month they took a civilian tanker and took it hostage, and it's still in port in Iran. So this is a significant development. And my last point is, however, if we're contemplating and putting armed forces, or at least offering up U.S. armed forces to board ships to protect them, commercial ships, this is unprecedented. Certainly never happened in my watch. So this is significant.
Yeah, a major development, and all it is happening.
All right. You see the world through a keyhole, right? When they do this sort of thing, they intentionally shorten the time horizon to make what's important about the existing strategic moment. And then they say, well, Iran did this thing, and this is a very important strategic thing, so therefore we need to respond. And they actually understate the response. It's U.S. Marines on commercial ships and 3,000 additional troops deployed to the Middle East and additional air support to the Middle East. Right, this is a much bigger change that they did. I found 3 different articles, each saying different things about this as far as like which components are being changed. They all agreed on the Marines on commercial ships. All the coverage was exactly like this. Where what they said on both Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, all that kind of stuff, where they say, Iran's been attacking our ships, so then we need to do this. We need to respond. Guess what? We've been attacking each other's ships for years. We've been playing this game with Iran, and I just discovered it this week. Was ignorant to this, where we've been okay. So there's this tanker, right? Okay. So there's this tanker. It's a Greek tanker called the Suez Rebranding. In April, was forced to head to Texas rather than China, right? So we literally went up beside it, pointed guns, and say, "You're going to Texas." Brought this thing to Texas, where then U.S. companies, basically held it. Carrying Iranian oil. According to recent media reports, U.S. companies are hesitant to discharge the oil because they fear reprisal attacks in Iran from the Persian Gulf. That was written at that time. Last year, the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in Greece and attempted to take the cargo, but a Greek court ruled against the confiscation, and Tehran seized 2 Greek tankers in response to the U.S. move and released them after the court's ruling. So we're like playing this piracy game with Iran, where we're taking each other's tankers from these other private companies simultaneously, right? We got Pirate Biden, like the great Pirate Biden out there sailing the high seas, taking oil tankers, and then using this as an escalatory excuse to bring more potential problems with that.
God, this is beautiful.
In 2021, the U.S. government sold 2 million barrels of Iranian oil for $110 million from a tanker seized near the UAE. During the Trump administration, we're doing the same thing. So Trump can also be a pirate, right?
We need to make a Trump pirate.
Yeah.
I'll make a Trump pirate.
We're equal opportunity Trump pirate makers. The insanity here is that we've been playing this crazy privateer pirate game for years and no one knows about it. And now is resulting in escalatory spiral over the Strait of Hormuz, right? And I'm not saying that Iran is the victim and America is the good guy here. All I'm saying is I don't trust that dude when he doesn't give the additional context, and I'll trust the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post when they don't give the additional context that we've been fighting this stupid, mercantile, crazy sanction regime war there. Because how the America always frames it is like, well, we're just enforcing sanctions, right? But what are you doing with the oil? Where's that money going? What are we doing? And then how could we be surprised when sanctions result in war when we use it as part of the escalatory spiral that could result in war? Sorry, I got really excited about that.
I love that.
Man.
I love it.
That was fun.
That was peak David outrage right there.
David in a Sonic the Hedgehog shirt, just going like, "We're just having piracy battles."
Well, it's like you said earlier. It's like a game of civilization, right?
Yeah.
Where you can like take the territory and you can either like raise it to the ground or like take the resources and sell it on the open market. That's what we're doing. We're doing that in real life. We're just like pirating.
Well, no, and it's the same thing like in the civilization game. Like there's a certain point in time where you can have like these privateer vessels that are like unflagged and you can just go start raiding people, you know, and it's not like part of your nation.
And remember, this is the same guy trying to build a new NATO for the Middle East. This is the same guy who's outraged by China getting better normalized relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Well, of course China can do that. You know why? Because we're pirates. Why would you cut a deal with pirates? We've been taking their oil and selling it on the open market and then benefiting it. Who knows where that money goes? Does it go into the general fund of the U.S. taxpayer? Isn't that crazy? Like, think about that for a second.
Okay, I need some clarity here. Let's take a couple deep breaths while I ask some questions, try to get some answers on behalf of the other people who might be a little bit confused.
Yeah.
So the U.S. and Iran are taking each other's oil tankers from that are owned by private companies that are just trafficking oil from countries that produce it to countries that purchase it, right? And literally, so we pulled up adjacent to an Iranian ship, effectively pointed guns at it and said, "You're not going to China, you're going to the U.S." Yeah, and it came to the U.S.
multiple times.
And then the oil was sold,
or someplace else that is controlled by U.S. interests.
And then the oil was sold to the United States.
We're sold to somebody. That's what's unclear about the coverage. The coverage that I have here pretty much just quotes in at 2021 $110 million from a tanker seized in the UAE.
So this is like
2 million barrels of Iranian crude.
What did China have to say about that? They probably were expecting that oil.
Yeah, can you imagine why Chinese relationships are probably not going great? And that bridges into the next thing we're talking about. But yeah, exactly.
That's crazy.
I mean, like, that's the crazy thing about sanctions. People think sanctions are just, we just put out a word and then all these businesses comply. Never mind that what it is a blockade, right? It is a virtual blockade that we are orchestrating. And then additionally that somebody is profiting from. I mean, $110 million is a small change in the U.S. foreign policy budget, but it's not nothing. You know, like, man, where did that money go? And what is the accountability to the taxpayer for when this gets out of control, right? We are currently spending how many tens of billions of dollars in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
We have additional commitments in Taiwan. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're trying to forge some new NATO arrangement in Ukraine, which is just another huge death clock to, nuclear annihilation, the same way it was in World War I. And then we have, the BRICS system rising up and then that pressure. Meanwhile, we're just like, piracy games. That can't possibly spiral out of control and have some kind of problem. I mean, it's just like, and I imagine you're not the only one who's very surprised that this is current U.S. foreign policy, that we have a privateer piracy clause that we're operating on right now.
Yeah. Wasn't this sort of thing going on and part of the cause of the American Revolution as well? British like intercepting mercantile ships going to the U.S. and things like that. Wasn't that something that was happening too?
Ask Russ. I don't know. Yeah, I know there's some stuff there, but I can't
we'll
recall.
There's the Barbary pirates with TJ.
Yeah, that's
Thomas
true.
Jefferson.
That's true.
Yeah,
maybe that's what I'm thinking of. But in any case,
shores of Tripoli, all that stuff.
Pretty wild stuff.
Yeah, right. I mean, it really blew my mind when I first read. I was like, I'm surprised that Iran. What happened? My mental model when I first read it was like, why would Iran do that? I mean, it's very strange that Iran would just out of the blue attack one of our ships. they're not crazy.
They know.
So I need to do some deeper research here.
That's actually a really important point. Is like I think oftentimes because we're looking at foreign policy through this keyhole, is that you have some general come up on TV and they say this thing, and everybody's just like, yeah, we need to do something about that, right? But like, you got to remember, these actors are not crazy. Like they are acting rationally according to how they are seeing the world in that current moment in time. It's not just like Iran just like, yep, we're just going to start picking off ships from the biggest dog on the block, right? like that's not what Iran is doing. It's like there's this back and forth that's going with a little bit of digging. You're understanding that, oh, we've been doing this for years back and forth with each other. It's not just like they're just like, we're going to attack America now. Like that's not what happened. Yeah.
Right. This is crazy. Why would they do that? It seems like just a terrible idea.
Yeah, it seems like the initial cause is, and I got more research to do. I tried to do as much as I could this week to really get my arms around this thing, but this, as far as I got, was there is when Obama created the Iran nuclear deal, sanctions were removed. We returned money that we stole from them after the Iranian Revolution. To be clear, it was theft. We froze their accounts, then took them, right, and then held on to them.
And that was a long time ago.
Yeah. This is the 60s. Right? God,
so we gave them that money back.
We gave them that money back and we reduced the sanctions. Trump comes in, he says that's a bad deal, and we exchanged all that for nuclear inspections, right? Trump says that was a bad deal. He ends that nuclear deal and reimposes the inspections, basically saying you have to comply with what we think you should comply with. And basically a more rigorous inspection regime that was agreed to in the deal.
So Jimmy Carter's 1979 is when it started.
1979, okay. So, yeah, I was way off. Jeez. So don't rely on me for when things happen. That's not my specialty. I know what happened. I just don't always know the dates. That's always
it could happen in the 1700s for all
I just know the progression of events, but when things happen, does not stick. Anyways, so when Trump gets out of that, there's a new inspection regime, and that's probably the origin of this particular tit for tat that we're playing with the piracy question. Right, where we're trying to enforce this sanction regime. They try to move oil out or return vessels, and we intercept them, and then we do stuff. Right, and at some point, the only one I have documentation, like certified, like cited documentation, is the 2021 one. But it also references that Iran was trying to sell oil to Venezuela, which is funny because Venezuela is an oil producing country. It used to be one of the largest in the world, but because of socialism, they failed. But they're trying to sell it there, and there's a huge problem there with gas and with energy and all that kind of stuff. And we intercepted their ship and returned it to America and took the oil, according to this.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Zesty Beverages. They're on a mission to the standard American diet by crafting drinks with fewer calories and more nutrients from real food. Their lineup of delicious offerings now includes Electric Peak Yerba Mate, postbiotic sodas, keto-friendly, ready-to-drink margaritas, and hard teas. Wondering what a postbiotic soda is? Well, head on over to zestybev.com to learn more and find a retailer near you. Once again, check them out online at zestybev.com. That's ZESTYBEV.com.
Now, a very different foreign policy issue is also coming up simultaneously. Well, so they're trying to just think about the ambition here, and you almost got to be appreciative of it. The Biden administration is doing everything they're doing in Ukraine, and we beat that dead horse to death, right? They have this new Middle Eastern policy with the new NATO, trying to fight the BRICS uprising, trying to fight China's influence in the Middle East, and the piracy, the piracy strategy. We just got to call it that from now on. And then additionally, they have there's a lot of new bubbling up of Taiwan and how we're going to respond to Taiwan. I'm not very good at Taiwan history, so I have a quick video. It's about 43 seconds long. I hope people will watch and listen to the whole thing.
And now U.S. President Joe Biden signs into law a bill that approves the first agreement under a bilateral trade initiative between the U.S. and Taiwan. Biden, though, said that certain sections of the law raised constitutional concerns. Biden adds he would treat those sections as non-binding if they infringe upon his constitutional authority to negotiate with a foreign partner. The first agreement under the 21st Century Trade Pact covers general principles related to customs and border procedures, as well as regulatory and anti-corruption practices. Both countries hope this will facilitate bilateral trade and investment flows by minimizing border formalities.
So what's interesting, there's a couple different dynamics here and a couple different threads to pull on. Number one, trade is generally good. It's a good thing. This isn't really a trade agreement, though. It's it cooperation on trade facilitation. So it doesn't change any existing trade tariffs or any of that kind of stuff. It basically mandates Taiwan adopt a bunch of our regulatory practices and vice versa. Anti-corruption, whatever that means. Keep in mind that the prosecutor in Ukraine was fired on anti-corruption for investigating Burisma. So who knows what that means in this case. And small, medium-sized enterprise regulation, basically saying about how those folks can get access to regulated international markets. That's according to the Council on Foreign Relations, believe it or not. So, yeah, interesting story. The president, talking about the internal politics first. So last week, we talked about how the president got all this authority after World War II to do a bunch of things in foreign policy they otherwise couldn't do, right? Part of that additionally was, it even precedes this, was the executive agreements. So these are called Ts. Trade executive agreements are these kind of innovative things that came out in between the interwar period to the afterwar period, that where the executive branch could pretty much create law without Congress internationally through an agreement between two executives. Right. So they're considered, and this is the great Wikipedia article on this, politically binding, but not legally binding.
The hell is that supposed to mean?
Basically, it means that if someone doesn't violate them, it's kind of like a shame on you sort of thing, but there's no real enforcement. But legally binding should, in international terms, mean enforcement, meaning we're going to do something in response.
What is the politically binding enforcement maneuver there? Is it just you're not cool with the culture in DC anymore? Is that what I mean? Is it like a social ostracization? It's
so funny because the Biden administration is simultaneously applauding this executive agreement. What was the executive agreement between NATO and Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? It wasn't legally binding, but it was politically. Does that make sense? The U.S. is supposed to feel ashamed that it went back on its word not to expand NATO towards Russia. No, Oops. The U.S. just goes, we never agreed to that. It's not in paper, blah, 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 blah. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You got psychopaths over here making these kind of agreements. You can't trust them. What are you talking about?
Some schoolyard shit. Some no takebacks.
Yes, exactly. So, So this only exists because the Supreme Court basically said this is okay back in 1957. All right, because there was adjudication about whether or not the executive can do this. And we know during the Cold War, there was a tremendous amount of consolidation of power under the president because everyone was wanting to fight communism and I was so afraid of it. So, and the Supreme Court was also subject to that. And that's one of the important things that people should know. Congress gave up a lot of their authority in war making, such as the War Powers Act and other things. The Supreme Court also engaged in that during the Cold War. But wait, there's more. All right, I found this great Brookings Institute study on executive agreements. Get this. All right. It's kind of dense, but I'll unpack it after I read it. Analysis revealed major differences with the online publication regime of executive agreements. I'm just punching that in. As just 31% of executive agreements reported to Congress were included in the official online database. Just 31% of all the agreements out there that were reported to Congress were included on the official online database for what are out there as a third party to look at. Far less than one could locate in comparable private databases. Other problems were evident in the congressional reporting regime as well, as a substantial number of cover memos suggested that the executive agreement in question were being transmitted late, while private databases contained several thousand such agreements that were never transmitted to Congress. Thousands of existing executive agreements have never been communicated to Congress. Moreover, problematic still, the cover letters showed that the legal basis for many of the executive branch's uses of executive agreements was questionable, as less than half pointed to express statutory authorization for engaging in the executive agreement in question, while 17% cited statutes that could not plausibly be read as providing any such authorization.
Jesus. Oh my God.
That means the executive's just going out there, making agreements without any congressional approval at all, or statute to justify them.
No legal basis.
Yeah, and that means it's not just some of it. 17% had no basis at all, and a majority of it didn't have a clear legal basis.
Do you have any idea what time frame these executive agreements are based in? Are these just recently? Are these since the 70s?
This is since they were created in 1957.
In 57.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And this was like, and the study was done just a couple years ago. I forgot to link it. Shut. I'll make sure to send you the link so we could punch it in here so people could look it up themselves. And if I'm reading this right, what it appears to be is like there's all these executive agreements, some of them security, some of them on trade and stuff like that. They should be, in order to be constitutional by the 1957 declaration of this, decision on this, they should be in pursuit of some existing code that Congress has passed, right? They have to have a connection to an authorization. But this is saying almost none of them are.
They're just out there like just gallivanting, like making deals that have no basis in law, that the executive branch, like, it seems like doesn't have the authority to create.
Yes.
Well, here's
at
something.
Least 17%.
Here's something interesting too. So the Case Zablocki Act of 1972 requires the president to inform the Senate within 60 days of any executive agreement being made. No restriction was placed on presidential powers to make such an agreement. The notification requirement enabled Congress to vote to cancel any executive agreement or to refuse to fund its implementation. But if none of these are being reported in any way, like,
how do they know?
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this Taiwan thing is this is in part because it passed Congress as like a part of an agreement. It was initially an executive agreement and now it's come through as a full like agreement with Congress, is that the Congress is now recognizing after Trump that the president probably has too much authority to do unilateral trade changes. Therefore, they're trying to reassert there. And that's probably a major story in this, and there's like a bipartisan agreement there, and I am in favor of it. Presidents shouldn't be able to use trade practices willy-nilly in order to change industrial policy just without any check from Congress. It's wrong to do that.
Well, it is, and it has real effects on the American people. I mean, it can have major price implications for consumer goods that we're used to purchasing at a given price. I mean, it can change all sorts of stuff that have trickle down effects on everyday people. So of course it should be covered and monitored by Congress. Absolutely.
And if you notice there, the part where they say, and Biden said that there are parts that might have constitutional issues, what he means is the parts where Congress is saying he can't do something. Right. That's what he means there. And therefore he's basically saying, I'm just going to ignore that part.
Well, obviously.
So think how extra constitutional we are. And I know we've made this argument 100 times on this podcast about how far we are from the congressional intent or constitutional intent. And what that means for, if the executive can just say, well, I'm just going to ignore what Congress says, that means you have to have a lawsuit in order to restrain them.
Wild.
So the other part of that, and the other part of the kind of the narrative here was what this means for China American relations on that. And I have this great video from the Quincy Institute to talk a little bit about that.
Did you know that Taiwan is possibly the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth? That an actual war could break out between the US and China over this island? Experts say that war would be catastrophic for everyone involved, which makes the delicate peace that currently exists between Beijing and Washington all the more critical to maintain. But in Washington, there's a lot of political talk that makes war between the US and China sound inevitable.
Listen, I believe in a one-China policy, but I would be willing to fight for Taiwan.
How do we deter the PLA from invading Taiwan by denial?
Building up the military deterrent on the island of Taiwan. It's all to prevent a war.
The catchphrase being thrown around is deterrence. That's Washington speak for a massive arms buildup that proponents say will make China back down. But that's far from certain.
Taiwan is a non-negotiable issue for Chinese nationalism. If they think that the U.S. is trying to permanently separate Taiwan, they will use force. The more force the United States uses, the more force China will use. And if they lose any initial engagement, that's just going to be the first step in a much longer, much bloodier conflict.
So when does an arms buildup aimed at deterring become a provocation? It seems we're already on a path to war unless both sides provide credible assurances that they're committed to avoiding war and maintaining the status quo. When Nixon went to China in 1972, Taiwan was the greatest barrier to normalizing relations between the US and China. So a delicate understanding was formed. The US basically said it acknowledges China's claim to Taiwan, while also saying the island's legal status is undetermined. The US is open to peaceful reunification, but doesn't support formal independence for Taiwan. Finally, and this is important, the US is ambiguous about how it might respond to a conflict between Beijing and Taipei. In return, China would pursue a peaceful approach to unification and only use force when absolutely necessary to prevent the permanent separation of Taiwan from China. Now, for more than 50 years, this understanding helped maintain peace in the Taiwan Strait and generated prosperity for all parties involved. But lately, the US and China have been escalating threats, and that's eroded trust. With China's increased military bluster against Taiwan, calls are growing in Washington for the US to explicitly commit our military to defending Taiwan.
We do need to change our policy and explicitly state clearly and deliberately that we will aid Taiwan if China goes for the jugular there. For decades, we've been ambiguous about that.
They call it strategic clarity. It's a major shift in policy that fundamentally goes against the US commitment about how it would respond to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And that tests Beijing's trust in US intentions. With all this in mind, shouldn't we try to halt the slide towards confrontation and avoid forcing Beijing into a corner that only increases the likelihood of war? Should we also consider what the people of Taiwan want? Polls suggest they don't want to be swallowed up by China, but they don't want a war either. Wouldn't a less confrontational approach between Washington and Beijing serve the people of Taiwan better than a slow march towards a war in which their home becomes a battleground for two nuclear-armed superpowers? The US faces a geostrategic challenge in China, which means the stakes are high. The threat of war comes with incalculable costs. But our many shared vital interests still require cooperation and can bring benefits. So the US needs to keep a diplomatic door open if it wants to have a partner on the other side.
So that's the Quincy Institute. I highly recommend them if you're a foreign policy nerd and you want to get into it. They have really great stuff. They do great panels. They do great articles. They just do wonderful work. They're just a think tank here in the States. So I want folks to just think really carefully about, like, okay, so this new engagement with Taiwan, additional trade barriers aren't being lowered. We have a bunch of new regulations that are going to apply to Taiwan. This is an intertingling of American relations with Taiwan. We had Speaker Pelosi fly to Taiwan recently, which was quite provocative for the Chinese. Because keep in mind, the Chinese themselves are saying Taiwan is ours and has always been ours, right? And they've existed and prospered in this place of ambiguity about whether or not they are China's or whether or not they're a free country. And the people who are saying, hey, we need to make sure that we beef up Taiwan's defenses in order to prevent China from ever doing that, I want to ask them a question. Why would it work there when it didn't work in Ukraine? We've been beefing up Ukraine's defenses for a very long time. Additionally, Ukraine has a bunch of ground between it and Moscow. This is 20 miles of water, right? If this was, and what if beefing up their defense actually led us closer to war? What standard of evidence would they use to know when it isn't? Because it seems to me that it is. And what I want to do is try to put the listener ahead of the curve on this escalatory spiral, right? Which is that, you know, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad that we have this trade agreement with Taiwan. I really, you know, I'm not sure how I feel about it at all, right? Because it doesn't actually lower trade barriers, so it doesn't actually going to make anyone more prosperous. It's just going to regulate each party more. So I'm not sure if that's really that beneficial. But I would say that, you know, the diplomatic door question is really, really critical, right? And we stopped doing that to Russia. At one point, the State Department said, we're not talking to Russia anymore because they're doing the wrong thing, rather than doing the opposite and peaceful loving and peaceful pursuing thing, which is continue to communicate even when there are high tensions, such as even at the height of the Cold War, we still could talk to the USSR, but we're not talking to Russia now. To not do that in China is critical. And then what is it going to do to push China closer to Russia if we continue this pressure and build up for Taiwan to, you know, to do what I think it was Senator Cotton mentioned there, which is to make them an impenetrable fortress and use the bodies of the Taiwanese people as our backstop for China's expansion.
Right. I'm curious because you mentioned that Taiwan has prospered in this ambiguity between whether they are a part of China or they're an independent state. Is there any clarity on like what the majority of the Taiwanese people want or what they consider themselves to be? Because I know, like with Ukraine as an example, there are some folks that feel more unified with Russia, feel more Russian, and some folks that feel more independent. Is there a similar dynamic in Taiwan that we know of?
I think the majority in Taiwan want to maintain independence from China, much like in Hong Kong, there was a majority that wanted to maintain independence, but there is a minority that is China friendly. It's hard to say. I mean, it's one of those things that maybe democracy isn't the best solution for, right? I mean, it's better to not have a democratic vote on some things, such as, do I have rights, right? Or do we join the communist, government? But I think, in general, the question is what is the right use of U.S. military presence?
Right.
And should we be, gosh, it's been funny as people have criticized the Ukraine war, basically to say, but we should be doing the same thing we're doing in Ukraine in Taiwan, without learning the lesson of maybe arming a country on the border of another country that is a major, emergent superpower might be more provocative than not.
You would think, especially with the live example going on in Ukraine on the opposite side of that same, massive land. And I think the other question to ask there, apart from should we be, is can we be? And, we haven't discussed this directly, but it was also in the news that Fitch, the credit ratings agency, downgraded the U.S. debt from AAA to AA+, which is basically saying it's a little riskier now to invest in government debt, U.S. government debt, than it was, simply because we are in a state where we're spending a ton of money. We have no real clear strategy or plan that's been expressed to address that, other than just print more, which is, of course, threatening and risky for holders of the U.S. government debt. So can we be putting our military might, in quotes, out around the world at the expense of, our credibility as a debtor nation, which we are?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
To answer your question about how Taiwanese citizens feel about the China versus Taiwan situation, what I'm seeing right here in a Pew survey was found that about 60% of Taiwanese citizens have an unfavorable view of China, while 52% support closer economic ties with China. Only 36% favor closer political ties, though. Conversely, more than 2/3 have a favorable view of the United States, with 79% supporting closer political ties with the U.S. So
interesting.
Which could mean, right? Keep in mind what's China's line here. China's line is if we can lose Taiwan permanently, then we'll go to war. That's the line they've drawn and have drawn since the 1970s.
Well, and one of the biggest important factors here is Taiwan produces 50% of the semiconductors in the world. With Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is that TSMC, being the biggest player in the world. And that seems to me like what the real fight is over here is like, this is the digital age, it's the arms race, is the need of those semiconductors. What do you feel about Vivek Ramaswamy's kind of thing here on this? I know I've seen him talking a lot about how if he was president, he would be using Ukraine as like a negotiating factor to pull Russia away from China, which then would make Taiwan probably less of an issue because China would have less of this like Russia alliance kind of in the foreground. Right there. In the meantime, like that one helps kind of preserve Taiwan because of the semiconductor issue, and then hopefully allows us in the U.S. to bump up manufacturing of semiconductors in the meantime, and then incentivizing that.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, that's at least what I've seen. His policy on this seems to be the most articulated and the most the biggest logic thread throughout. Well, everybody else just like must defend Taiwan. It's like
there's a lot of dogma.
I'm actually seeing the thought process behind it, which is much more interesting to me.
Absolutely. Well, I think similarly, he says, in response to the question of would you defend Taiwan, he has said, at least I'm recalling, strategically, yes, until we have enough semiconductor production in the United States to not be dependent upon that, because I think that really is the core dependency that we have on Taiwan right now.
And that's part of this negotiation with Russia on the Ukraine stuff, is to help fill in that like 5 years or however long it would take for that. And then we can just have kind of a more hands-off policy on Taiwan.
And we know
afterwards.
semiconductors have been built more in the United States and other areas in the world in the recent years too. Like there's been a lot of new semiconductor startups because people have seen this coming for some time.
For sure.
And I'm also very skeptical. People are like, oh, China's whole goal is to take over Taiwan to keep all the semiconductors. It's like, I'm not sure the semiconductor business would survive an invasion.
True.
Number one. Number two, even if you do that, what's valuable is the human capital, number one. And those people tend to die in wars, especially in wars on a small island. That's going to include a lot of rockets. And then in machinery, which doesn't survive explosions, right? So all the valuable things, doesn't make a lot of sense for China to do that but you have to understand, we're seeing it like a semiconductor fight. I think that's true from the American point of view.
It's a variable.
It's not their point of view. It's a religious fight from their point of view. It has to do with the very origins of the Chinese state, the Communist Party state, and the fact that the people who were opposed to them all went to Taiwan and have been there ever since. Right. And it has to do with the fact that this is so close to them, that it's this area that they've held traditionally over a long period of time as a part of the China government. So, I mean, pre-Mao. So it's a completely different set of variables for them. And it's the idea of losing something like that is so critical. It'd be like us losing the Florida Keys, right?
Yeah.
What's the island just off of California? San Juan?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. It'd be like losing that right there. It's right next to us. And then what's interesting there is all the hawks saying, "Oh, well, but they're policing, they're interfering in the sea between China and Taiwan, as if that's not their seas, right?" I mean, that's kind of insane.
It's pretty crazy. We should probably jump to these last two stories before we run out of time here, or maybe we should pick one because we got about 12 minutes left here before we got to take off. So
all right, so a Minneapolis judge has sentenced I'm gonna butcher this guy's name. I'm sorry, Tao Thau, a former police officer who held back bystanders as other officers pinned George Floyd to the ground, 4 years and 9 months in state prison. So he's been accused or been convicted of that. Just some background context: the guy that everyone associates with this incident is a guy named Chauvin, right?
Derek Chauvin.
Yeah, and he's the senior officer at the scene. He was convicted of murder and manslaughter in 2021. And later pleaded guilty in a federal case for removal of his constitutional rights. That's what the federal cases are about. And this is what this gentleman, former police officer, is being convicted of. Two other officers, Alexander Knung,
I would just probably say Kung,
and Thomas Lane, pleaded guilty to state charges of aiding and abetting manslaughter and were convicted with Thau in their federal case. The judge wrote that under Minneapolis Police Department policies, it was objectively unreasonable to, among other things, encourage fellow officers to engage in dangerous prone restraint for 9 minutes and 24 seconds, encouraging those officers not to use a hobble, actively insist in their restraint by acting as a human, quote, human traffic cone, end quote, and prevent bystanders from rendering medical aid. And then lastly, the judge said Tao's actions were even more unreasonable in light of the fact that he was under a duty to intervene, which is very important, right? Because that's a very specific code, duty to intervene code, to stop the other officer's excessive use of force and was trained to render medical aid. So what's interesting about this is how it flips a lot of things that are current existing federal code on its head, right? So typically officers enjoyed, which is called... whoa, I just spaced it. What's it called?
Qualified immunity.
Qualified immunity. Wow, that was just like zipped right out of my head there. Yeah, so that's not holding up in this case, right? It's saying it flips a lot of those things on its head. Said, no, police officers have a duty to protect the lives of civilians during this sort of interaction.
Okay, so and this sort of creates a new paradigm, right? Because typically at an active crime scene, there will be an officer or officers dealing with the crime, and then there are always other officers managing a crowd if there's a crowd around, right? Mm-hmm. So this is saying that instead of those officers keeping potentially, aggressive or otherwise people from intervening in the crime that's being committed or that's being policed in that environment, those officers then need to turn their attention to their colleagues and the crime being, policed, and protect the person being restrained by the officers from their fellow officers. Mm-hmm. That's what this is saying.
It's actually even a little more radical than that. If you notice, it says his crime is that he didn't allow the people. He did his job was his crime. He didn't allow the civilians to interrupt what was happening, and he didn't interrupt what was happening. And he was trained in medical aid, and he didn't help. So that was what was crazy about it. And it's a very interesting thing. I'm not sure how to feel about it, right? On one end, I kind of see what you're kind of pointing at, which is like, maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was too busy. Like his focus was in another direction. I mean, obviously it's saying that he assisted in the thing, that he encouraged those officers not to use a hobble.
I don't know what that is.
Good question. What is a hobble? I didn't get around to.
I'm on it.
I mean, the question to me is that, sort of around the diffusion of responsibility, right? Like, there's some of these famous situations, stories that have highlighted this, where, for example, the Kitty Genovese case, right? Where like she was stabbed on the street and she's crying out for help, and bystanders heard her in New York City or, a large populous area, and no one did anything because they thought that someone else would do something. Like this is sort of adjacent to that in a sense, because essentially what it's saying is you're guilty as a bystander, an officer or otherwise, seemingly, if you are capable of intervening in someone being harmed and you don't, you're guilty for the crime that was committed by someone else.
Yeah, I mean, at minimum, it's saying an officer is, right? Because that's kind of what we have them for.
But how right? But how strong is that division here in this case?
Yeah, I knew it was a horse term. Hobble.
Yeah, it's just a strap that you use to put around a human or
something
an animal's legs. It's
something they could have used to restrain George Floyd instead of a knee on his neck.
Additionally, that kneeling on the back of someone's neck is a terrible idea for restraining somebody.
Yeah.
And I really recommend folks who are trying to navigate the question of like physical restraint. Check out the Gracie brothers, their stuff on this. The Gracie brothers have a whole course that they teach police officers that is really, really great. That to safely restrain people in ways that would prevent some of these bad outcomes. And then there's some legislators are going too far. Like for example, like banning chokeholds and various different joint locks and stuff like that. That's probably a really bad idea. For officer safety and be able to restrain somebody.
Yeah.
But the one that these officers used in this very specific circumstance was too high up on the neck. It should be in the center back. And once you restrain his arms, you should roll him over so that he's sitting on his back. And that would probably be a more proper way to keep someone healthy. And then lastly, I hate to mention this because it's such a thing that a lot of people say is a dog whistle, but there was no doubt that the guy was on drugs and was probably having cardiac problems with those drugs. And there was probably a hesitation to use to help the guy, and that was probably criminal, right?
Yeah.
Right. If the guy's having problems, your duty as a police officer is to help the guy.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that point stands even given the guy's drug use. And
for sure.
Complications because of that.
Applying life-saving aid would be like key.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Especially over 9 minutes. 9 minutes is a long time. Man.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So anyways, that's an interesting development, and there's going to be probably a lot of more debate about criminal justice reform and what that means and how to think about that. We got to dive into that, get some more principle-based discussion, but we don't have the time for that today because we got to talk about the head of the Oversight Committee, Rep. James Comer. He has an interview on the payments for the Joe Biden family received while he was VP. We will link to it in the show notes. Let me just give you the short one, the short summary here, because this is really important. We've been talking about it for weeks. Number one, timeline. This is David's timeline to these shenanigans. Joe Biden becomes VP, right? 2, family receives payments, millions of dollars, gifts like diamonds from China, supercars from other countries, etc. And these are, shell companies from other countries. These are payments to the Biden family directly and to shell companies owned by the Bidens. That's what came out this week. That's step number 2, right? That's what we've been waiting on, which is we know Biden is VP. We know his family has all these relations, these strange relations with other entities. We know a bunch of people in the Biden family have been getting payments, not just Hunter, also like the family dog. I'm going a little etc.
Well, and I think there's an interesting corollary here as well. There was a Russian oligarch who gifted a bunch of money.
Yeah.
And then when all of the assets were being seized from Russian oligarchs during the Ukraine invasion, this guy was exempted.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find the article.
Yeah, and the accusation by Representative Comer is that these funds were intermingled and accessible to Biden. Here's why he thinks that. We have a text message from Hunter to Hunter's daughter saying that he was paying for Biden's living expenses. Another dimension was Joe Biden is a pirate.
Let's bring Joe Biden the pirate back.
He's already back up there.
I love it. By the way, I just have to say the one with the sunglasses, the John Lennon style sunglasses, that's choice.
That's thumbnail material.
We need to see the aviators though. We need to adjust for the aviators.
All right. So review. Joe Biden becomes president. Family receives payments. Biden happens to pursue policy that appears to assist the family members' income streams, meaning these income streams are coming in and Biden does policies in order to preserve that. Great example is the Russian oligarch. Another one that we know a lot about is Burisma. The investigator, Shokin, is investigating Burisma. Burisma, we have video of Biden at the CFR meeting saying, I went in and I got this guy fired. And, now that guy is no longer, and then soon after that, those charges are dropped by the next guy coming in. So how this all relates is the question is those payments, is that influence peddling? And influence peddling, and last week I said, if it's not illegal, it should be. What I meant by that is the status is less important to me than the ought, right? Ought it be illegal? Absolutely. We now are discovering how illegal and corrupt this possibly could be. The current existing status is that it would be illegal if he is not registered as a foreign agent, right? And I'm not sure I care about that as much as I just care about, it not happening, right? And I'm not sure them registering as a foreign agent would have prevented it from happening. But the crazy thing is we're in the world we're in right now where it is illegal if you're not a foreign agent. None of these people are foreign agents. Like they're not registered that way. So all of this was illegal. And then additionally, is Biden liable for talking to them about these things as a foreign agent? That's another question that I don't have an answer yet for.
Well, very obviously, there is a lot more coming out daily, and I'm suspicious that this is going to be Biden's undoing and the way that the Dems get away from running him again in 2024. But that's just my speculation. We'll have to find out more about that as the evidence continues to flow in. For today, that's all we have time for. David Rand, Kyle Mack, thank you so much for watching at home. Please do like, subscribe, comment, all those things. Share this with your friends, and we will see you next week. Thanks. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Liberty Portal podcast. To help us fight internet censorship, we really appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe, follow, hit the notification bell, do whatever it is that you do wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast. To find us on social media and everywhere around the web, visit us at linktree.com/libertyportalpod. And remember,
well, of course China can do that. You know why? Because we're pirates. Why would you cut a deal with pirates? We've been taking their oil and selling it on the open market and then benefiting it. Who knows where that money goes? Does it go into the general fund of the U.S. taxpayer? Isn't that crazy? Like, think about that for a second.